that this is very fun. Totally haven't already tried to record this like 5 times. Hopefully. Uh, for my review topic, I chose neuropeptides and their effects on cognition and neuroplasticity in humans and animal models. So, a quick definition for a neuropeptide is neuropeptides are small protein like molecules composed of amino acids that act on neurons or other aspects of the nervous system. The three neuropeptides that I discussed in this review were insulin like growth factor 1, which is a folded single chain polypeptide that is composed of 70 amino acids, brain derived neurotrophic factor, which is a folded double chain polypeptide composed of 119 amino acids, and ghrelin, which is a flexible single chain polypeptide composed of 28 amino acids. So IGF-1 has been correlated with hippocampal neurogenesis, also synaptic alterations, which is primarily referring to forming new synapses and strengthening the synapses that are already there through myelination. And because it's forming new neurons in the hippocampus, it's associated very strongly with learning and memory, which gives a means to prevent cognitive decline. The highest the highest density of IGF-1 receptors in the entire body is actually in the hippocampus itself, which was honestly kind of surprising to me. I wasn't expecting that, but increased serum levels of IGF-1 was correlated with increased cognitive performance, especially in elderly adults, not exclusively, but primarily. And IGF-1 treatment was associated with lowering inflammation and lowering oxidative stress. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor was associated with synaptic plasticity and pruning, neurogenesis, neuroprotection, memory and learning, and the growth of other neural tissues. And one of the primary things that brain-derived neurotrophic factor does is strengthen excitatory connections and actually weaken inhibitory ones, which is it can be pretty beneficial. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor was also associated with an increase in long-term potentiation, which is the primary mechanism of learning that your brain uses. Pro-BDNF or pro-brain-derived neurotrophic factor is one of the primary precursors to brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and the precursor was heavily involved in synaptic pruning and apoptosis of abnormal neural cells, and apoptosis meaning just regulated cell death. Decreased BDNF levels were not correlated with decreased number of neurons, but it was decreased with synaptic plasticity. Aerobic exercise was correlated with increased brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels, um, which were also correlated with increased synaptic remodeling and increased contextual and spatial memory, and a lower concentration of brain-derived I've just got to say BDNF. Uh, a decreased concentration of BDNF was correlated with a decreased volume in the hippocampus. Like the previous study, I said specifically in older adults, but not exclusively only in older adults. Ghrelin is a growth hormone releasing peptide, which is mainly, or not pretty much primarily synthesized in the stomach, which I remember from anatomy and physiology too. So I was actually pretty surprised. Thought it was pretty cool that it's a neuropeptide. Um, it has indirect influences on BDNF levels. It has direct correlations with hippocampal neurogenesis, and then associated with that, it increases memory and learning, and also neuroplasticity. It has a very high density of ghrelin receptor in the hippocampus, but also in the hypothalamus as well. Uh, Ghrelin disruption was correlated with a lower amount of progenitor cells and a lower amount of newly formed neurons in the hippocampus. And one thing that I actually thought was very interesting, dietary restriction is associated with increased ghrelin levels, and that's not so much surprising. But the increased ghrelin levels associated with dietary restriction is actually associated with survival of new hippocampal neurons and increased synaptic plasticity, which I thought was interesting how indirectly, you know, restricting your dietary intake can, enhance your memory and learning capacity. I just thought that was very interesting. When it also lowers the threshold for LTP, as discussed in the previous slide. LTP is long-term potentiation, or your brain's primary mechanism of learning. Oh, I went too far. Uh, so modern techniques and technology allow for an easy way to study peptides and how they affect the human body, especially with techniques that allow for molecule tracking throughout circulation of the body. In one of the IGF-1 studies that I looked at, they used a radio labeled IGF-1 to be able to track it through the circulation of the entire body. And they actually figured out there by doing that how IGF-1 who was able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Now, one of the issues that I saw in a lot of the studies that I looked at for this was a lot of them relied on injecting exogenous peptides, which may elicit an like a non-natural response. Because even if the injected peptides are bioidentical, adding extra hormone to the body can cause sort of a oversaturation effect, and that could skew the results of any of those studies. There was also a very heavy reliance on the use of animal models. And as we all know, you can't always compare the results from animal models and apply them to people. It doesn't always work that way. It's not that simple. And there were also very few results in the studies that I looked at that showed any effect on executive function or high order thinking. I think for the most part, pretty much all the studies that I looked at focused on learning and memory. Um, reviewing these peptides showed the importance of peptides as they apply to the neurological physiology and their widespread effects. You had a deeper understanding to how our neurodevelopment happens throughout the lifespan, and it gives neuroscientists a tool for clinical intervention when it comes to combating cognitive decline. I believe IGF-1 and ghrelin both showed. I think all three of them, yeah, all three of the peptides showed great promise in that area. And also, actually, yeah, no, all three of them showed a lot of promise in all three of these aspects. Combating cognitive decline, preventing neurodegeneration, and enhancing cognitive functions. Uh, my personal opinion for the future directions of research on the peptide. Firstly, I would like to see more exclusive human studies. There were there were quite a few of them out there, but they were mostly, you know, on very specific conditions like depression or Parkinson's and stuff like that, which I would like to see more general human studies out there. And I would also, I know it's not always possible, but I would like to see the use of, or not the use of, but studies using the endogenously produced peptides and not ingesting exogenous ones. And there needs to be more research that shows results on executive function and high order thinking. And I would also like there to see more research on other brain regions, because there were a couple other ones mentioned, but I believe the pretty much all of them just kind of focused on